So actually, maybe I should start with asking you to introduce yourself a little bit. So, Rafael Luciani, theologian, very involved with all of the stuff that's going on with the synods in Rome. You've been a close follower and a scholar of the kind of theology that Pope Francis is engaged in. What else should I be letting people know about you?
Well, I have an experience of over 20 years working in Latin America. And my way of doing theology is always connected to a pastoral life, as we do in our continent, and the way also we engage with the people in the communities shapes our way of thinking and discerning not only the church, but also the world in the context and the challenges that it brings to us today, you know. So I guess that's my experience, what I want to bring, and from where I want to share what theology, and in this case also synodality, means and embraces today's option in the church. You know?
Great. Yeah, thank you. So I guess it's officially kind of beginning in October. Is that right? This process of this preparation for the Synod of all the continents, the Synod on Synodality. What can you tell us about this Synod? How is it different from previous ones? What else is happening here that people should know about?
Yes, one of the most important things in Francis's pontificate is trying to involve as many people from different cultures and continents as possible. So the synods have been that place where local churches gather together and they try to think over common issues that affect the church and society today. There has been also a progress and involvement and development in the way in which synods are conceived under Francis. And this current synod is now changing what it means for a church to celebrate such an event, because it is not anymore a one-time meeting of the Universal Church for a month in Rome. It became a process that starts in each local church with the local communities, and then from there it builds up to Rome in a 2-year process with different phases and stages that will be let's say framing the way in which the synod develops throughout these 2 years. No, so this is new because it is not anymore about Rome giving directions to the rest of the church in each country, but it's the opposite. It's the church in each one, in each locality, in each reality, that is going to do a consultation to their own communities, and that will be listened by Rome, and then engaging in a dialogue with this reality that we're facing today in the church and in society. You know?
Right. So that's part of why there's this long time frame for it, right? Because it's not just like a handful of people having a meeting in one location. It's like somehow trying to involve the whole church and build up preparation for when that actually happens, that final meeting in Rome. Is that correct?
Yes, and we have the experience even before Francis pontificated that bishops went to the synods. And they usually commented on something they personally had to say or had reflected upon or have written. In this case, what is changing is that the bishop represents a part of the people of God, and thus a diocese. So they have to bring the voice of that local church, not of their own opinion. And that also changes the way in which Rome engages with the local churches, because the bishops gathered in the synod, they should bring that experience, that call, that claims, those hopes of their communities, and be a voice for them. So this is new. It's a new practice. It's a new style. We have to now see how the mentality in the church changes and adapts to this new way of being church.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So this movement, these developments in synodal practice, are they the idea of Pope Francis, or do they come from somewhere else?
Yes, they're not Francis's idea in the sense that he would have invented what synodality is today. This comes from the Second Vatican Council's Ecclesiology of the People of God, which Francis, from the first day of his pontificate, embraces and has advanced. So synodality can be understood as, for example, a new hermeneutics of how do we understand the ecclesial subjects, laity, bishops, religious, the Pope, and how do they relate to each other in a co-responsible way and not in an auxiliary way. Like if I were just helping someone in the church, in this case, it's not about that. It's that I am assuming as a subject in the church my responsibility, and that is a shared responsibility. So synodality changes the way in which we relate to each other, the communicative dynamics, how do we communicate in the church, and the structures that need to be adapted or updated to that way of being church. So it's a more complex reception of the ecclesiology of the people of God, but in today's context and in today's way of understanding the challenges of the church.
I see. Yeah, I like the word you used there, co-responsible. So there's a way in which all of the faithful are sharing responsibility for what the church is and which direction the church moves. And I like that idea. It's very different. We often are accustomed to thinking of hierarchical institution in such a way that we would be passive consumers of the church. But you're saying that this is the other way around, like all of the faithful are being called to be responsible contributors to the church. Is that correct? Am I hearing you right?
Yes. And in fact, when Francis began his pontificate, in the first interview he offers to the public, he says in that time to Espadaro that Lumen Gentium 12 was for him very important. And that text says about how the totality of the faithful, not each one or a group of faithful, but as a totality, as an interaction, as a common group, are the ones that are subject and do not err. And that means a huge step in the church, because when we say that the faithful is a bishop, the faithful is the Pope, the faithful is a lay, the faithful is a religious, those ecclesial subjects have to have an horizontal relationship and not a hierarchical relationship in order to relate to each other. So the word faithful is a very powerful word in the way in which Francis receives that text of Lumen Gentium 12 puts that into a practice, no? This is something that can be also referred to the Latin American way of being church, because when we can define the different styles of each church in different regions and countries and cultures, the Latin American way of relating in the church is very horizontal because it's very pastoral. That doesn't mean that we do not have clericalism. What it means is that the relationships among bishops, on laity and religious life are more collaborative, are more co-responsible. And in fact, right now, we just created this new structure called the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazon, SEAMA, and it's structured around shared co-responsibility, shared power, shared decision-making and taking, which is very new. And this is part of that advancing of Lumen Gentium 12 that Francis has put into motion in his pontificate.
I see. Yeah, so that leads into one of my other questions. So I've noticed in social media, even just this morning, I found a conversation in Facebook where some Catholics in the US are concerned about there being challenges about implementing the synodality here in the US context. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what are the challenges for the US context, and then maybe what might we learn here in North America from what has been done in Latin America that could help move that process along and help the US church grow in synodality?
Yes, synodality has a cultural component in order to function or to be received well. And if in a culture, the individual relationships are much more value than the communal relationships, that's something that we have to take into account and try to change, because when we speak about synodality, it's always about a culture of consensus, a culture of communal discernment, a culture of communal prayer. So it's about a communal being, not only of church, but also of each of us as persons. So in the case of the US church, what I have seen in my experience is that it needs to embrace much more a way of working in which bishops, laity, religious life do not understand themselves as separate subjects. And one of them does something, the other one does another thing, but at the end, the bishops are understanding themselves as separated from the rest of the faithful. So there has to be a ecclesial cultural change, and also a cultural change in the way we understand our daily relationships. One of the also challenges that I see here regarding, for example, the existence of diversity in the church is that we cannot have different churches within the US church. And for example, the Hispanics would have a different place even in most parishes, where they have another space where they have their own life, but they're not connected with the rest of the church. So we cannot have this way of segregating or putting aside different groups. How can we integrate from now on? How can we build this communal sense? And the only thing that I could say is that personal relationships are the only experience that shape us. So if I am in a Hispanic community and then I have another a white Catholic community and they do not relate to each other in a personal interaction, we will never have a synodal church, because I would never know how the other thinks. What the other thinks, what is the other's story in his life, the background. So I need to recover as a church personal relationships within diversity, and not divide in different groups, because I have to be in my own group culturally and then the other in the other group culturally. So this is a big challenge today, because we cannot have a group that has less resources and less attention, and then another group that has the opposite, more resources and attention. And I think that the US church, as Boston College's studies have proved, is practically half Hispanic at this point. So how can we create that bridge and do a church of a communal way of being right now in this moment? No?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you point out, in the US, we just have like deeply rooted in our culture kind of extreme individualism. And I can see how that could contribute to this. It also seems like it's almost like you're suggesting that we need more of these kind of encounter experiences, even within our own parishes, between, you know, the different ethnic groups and other forms of diversity in order to address this. What are some things that have been learned through the Latin American experience that you think might be able to help the U.S. context move into a greater synodality?
Yeah, we have in Latin America a way of being that has integrated so many cultures. We can just remember how after the Second War, we had the World War, we had the Europeans massively migrating to Latin America. And some countries like Argentina, Venezuela, and Brazil, we have a huge population of Europeans, and the way in which we incorporated those migrants created also a new way of church. This is the challenge that I see today regarding also these cultural changes in churches because of the diversity that exists. And the experience that we had is that at the beginning, each of these cultures had their own priest, their own parish, their own communities, their own schools, and little by little they were integrated into the bigger church in each country. And we never said there is this person that came from Italy, like my family, or there is this person that came from France, or there is this person that came from. We always began to learn that we were all Venezuelans or Argentinians or Brazilians. So today, for example, that's a huge challenge because in the case of the US church is right now the only church in the world that is changing because of this cultural integration of so many peoples and cultures from around the world. And this is a new challenge that cannot be responded only by creating 2 or 3 pastoral plans according to each group. So what I can bring as an experience from Latin America is that we always thought of a concept that is called pastoral de conjunto. It's like a common pastoral collaborative way of understanding the action of the church. So to put a practical thing in a parish, if I am going to read and discern the scriptures, I have in that same group 6, 7, 8 different nationalities and cultural backgrounds. So that interaction changes me because as each one of us shares that text of the scripture, we're sharing our life, we're sharing our perspective, we're sharing our experience from different cultures, and we're also sharing our own way of expressing and saying what we think about God and the church. If that happens in the US church or in any church, I can bet that is a way to start changing people's minds and hearts. But if I do not sit in the same table with those that are different, I will never change, and I will just create a tolerant practice, but it's not a communal practice. So diversity cannot be embraced by tolerance. It has to be embraced by new communal practices and relationship that helps me to be face to face with the other. And that's a challenge.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I mean, what you're describing makes me wonder if bishops and other, pastoral leaders in the US might not be able to kind of like cultivate some of these skills and things by recruiting, our immigrants from Latin America who have experiences with these kinds of ways of being church and these kinds of integration into places where that they can execute those kinds of activities and programs that would help bring that kind of unification.
Yeah, but it's not about saying that in Latin America we are better or not, it's trying to recover a practice that in the church in the first millennium was very common, which means this sense of being a community within a context where I had a diversity in terms of cultures, in terms of ways of thinking, philosophy, and so many things that came together in those communities. Mm-hmm. And those communities in its diversity were always working as a communal understanding in their practices. So when I put this example of Latin America, I can also bring the example of Italy or in Spain, where we in Latin America have learned a lot from them, because we have the same Latin roots where this communitarian sense of being a culture, and in this case, church, is very important, no? So it's not about only learning from these best practices, but I think that also recovering what in the US, the tradition that built up the US is, and it's still there, but people have lost that sense of that tradition, a country that was built on diversity, and that was built on migration, and that was built in a way in which that huge, immense richness had to work together in order to create what the US is today. So I think it's about recovering that tradition too, and not only receiving from external experiences good practices.
Yeah. No, I think that's beautiful. I think, that's deep roots all the way back to St. Paul, right? Yes. Trying to negotiate how to be a community as a church in spite of all kinds of diversity that's there. So if somebody happens to hear our interview and they're interested in getting involved with the current synodal process out of the grassroots, how might they do that in their diocese? How might they get involved with the synodal process in their diocese?
Yeah, there are two ways. One, through the dioceses that they have to appoint, most of them already have them in so many countries, a team that will be in charge of the local process. The consultations there will be logistically thought and built by this team that will be appointed. So parishes, communities, and not only parishes, but institutions in those dioceses of all types, not only Catholics, should be consulted, as it is said in the preparatory document for the synod. The other way is that we are all invited as not only individuals, but also as institutions to contribute directly and send our inputs to the General Secretariat of the Synod of the Bishops. And recently, we had a seminar on synodality for Latin America and the US Hispanic communities, where we had thousands and thousands of people connected. And the message that Cardinal Grech gave at the beginning of the seminar invited each institution to provide their own contribution directly to the Secretariat in Rome. And this is interesting because sometimes people are afraid if the diocesan process will receive what we have to say in that locality. So that's why we have now this other possibility. My hope is that institutions that have a lot to contribute with start doing something in that regards. There are initiatives right now of universities in Latin America that are gathering together to think in common how can they contribute to topics such as, for example, governance, because universities have departments of sociology, psychology, political sciences, theology, and they can bring all that knowledge together. Others have been working on the topic of power, potestas in the church in a more ecclesiological contribution. So there is a lot to do, not only as individuals in my diocese, but also as institutions in the society. We have to take the lead.
Great, that's very helpful to know. So if perchance someone was in a diocese that was not very engaged with the synodal process, there is a way that they can still contribute to the larger synod as it is.
Yes, and they should. That's the beauty of this new process. Before, everything went through directly the bishop and the let's say the hierarchy at that level. But from now on, and this started in the previous synod, in the Synod for the Panamazonian region, from now on, people and communities and institutions are invited directly to consult their own people and to get that input and send it to the General Secretariat. So this is a very new also culture of listening that is not only through the dioceses and the bishops, but also directly in a dialogue with Rome.
That's great. That's great to hear. So I think one last question that I have for you is, I've looked around and haven't seen a lot written on the topic of how people might practice synodality, like not just with the whole church, but just like within their own local parish or within their own other, local ecclesial structure, like a school or a ministry or a center or something. What are your thoughts on ways that people might try and practice synodality in those kind of very small local organizations?
Yes, I think that parishes, as they are understood and conceived today, need to be reformed. And there are experiences right now in that direction. In Latin America, Venezuela and Peru have initiated processes of discerning a new way of understanding a parish, a new model for parishes. Argentina is now celebrating a synod in the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires, and this is also one of the topics. I think that this is a topic that it needs to be embraced in terms of what can we think as a new model. And the new model that is now at least being discerned and looking ways to be implemented is a decentralized way of understanding the parish, where I have communities in all around the parish. We call it community of communities. So the parish becomes the center that gathers where people encounter from different communities, but then you have so many communities as you can build according to the reality of that parish. And in each small community should have its own leadership, ministries, and ways of working. For example, there may be a community with a type of needs that the other community has other type of needs. So I have to respond pastorally to each community and not have a one uniformed pastoral plan that responds to everything without taking into consideration each reality. And in each small community, I need to have small groups of discerning and sharing the scriptures. And this is a practice that is very important to do because we have limited our participation in a parish only practically to the Mass, receiving then catechism to participate in the sacraments, and a little formation that is offered sometimes in a parish. But that's practically in the majority of the parish what is being done. In this other model, you have a more personal contact with the scriptures, but in a communal environment with others where you share that scripture. So you're not an object receiving communion and then a homily. You become a subject participating in that precisely discernment of the scripture and making it yours. And another practice is that in those small communities, I will need to diversify ministries. We talk a lot about ministries, but when it comes to proposals, to building a theology with a concrete proposal for a new ministry, there is a lack of bibliography. There is a lot of bibliography talking about ministries in general or explaining the ministry that we have, but to think about new ways of exercising a ministerial church, I think that's a challenge that we have. For example, we are about to create in Latin America what is called a coordinator of a community, which you have more like this type of ministries in Austria, in Switzerland, and in Germany, where a lay person is practically a pastor or working as a pastor, and the priest is part of the equipe where that lay is coordinating the parish. So it's not the priest who is the pastor, and then the lay people are the one executing the pastoral plan. So there are new ways we have to do proposals, but we have to think and do the proposals. That's where I think there is a lack of material or literature being written. And that's a step that needs to be done by faculties of theology, for example, with concrete proposals of creating new ministries, not repeating or revising the ones that are currently, but also creating new ways for this 21st century. No?
Right. So there's a process of looking at the particularities, the needs of a given local community, and rather than just adopting ministries that have existed a priori, like doing some theology and figuring out what kind of ministry can we actually execute here to meet the needs in this place and develop that kind of a ministry. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, because sometimes when we study ministry, it's only the operational side, to use a word, that is being taught, and that's remaining in what is established already, just making it work a little bit better. But what I'm saying, that it was a mandate of the Synod for the Pan-Amazonian region, is that we need to create new ministries. But the theology to do that, the proposals, the theological proposals, the ecclesiological proposals, the pastoral proposals need to be created. In Latin America, there is a theologian, Antonio José de Almeida, that is part of the Ibero-American group of STM, and he has for years been one of the most important authors of proposing new ministries for the church in Latin America. We have right now in the German synodal path also commissions trying to think new ministries for the church. So I guess this is a challenge, not simply to teach how to operate and exercise ministries in our current institutional model of the church, but also how can we propose new ministries and from there start to building a new way of being church. That's a pending task that we have as theologians in the church.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if your two proposals might not work together somehow. If getting people together, having an encounter over the scriptures could then also inform this process of discerning what kinds of new ministries might be created in order to meet the local needs.
Well, there are experiences doing already that in the small communities. I mean, Even in the States, in Florida, there are communities that have been structured around this model of community of communities. Also in California, you have also models that are being put into practice with this perspective. So there are already initiatives and experiences, but they're not the ones that are best known or publicized or promoted. But that shows us that there is the interest that they can be done, that they are already a reality. But what I see that needs to be done is to assume as a direction of the whole church, in the case of the US or any other place, that this is a model that will be implemented as a church and not simply by one parish or two parishes. So we need to make an option, and that option implies a new pastoral model for each church. And that's where I see the difficulty, but I'll see the possibility because it's already being implemented by initiatives of parishes or communities. We need to make that a pastoral plan of the whole local church and not simply of some people on some communities. No?
Yeah. Well, often that's how things work, right? You have a proof of concept that is operating in one place, and then others have the opportunity to learn from their experience, and it can grow from there. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Rafael. Is there anything else that we should let people know about the synod or synodality in general before we end today?
Yes, I invite to read the preparatory document. In the last section, you have some of the questions that were proposed. The difference with this process and previous processes is that this is only a beginning. So the preparatory document that we received is just a first a way to approach the local churches and to initiate the motivation to engage in the process. We have to add to that document, and that's what the document invites us at the end, add our own questions as local church. What are the issues that we have in each local church, and precisely avoid homogenizing, uniformizing the problems in the church. We cannot see from only our problems in our local church the reality of the whole church. And maybe we have a problem here that in another local church doesn't exist. So what I mean is that we have to start from our own reality, as the preparatory document invites us to do, identifying our problems, and from there also building the listening and the consultation process. So it is a new way in which we have to assume our problems and try to make proposals and contribute to their transformations. Right now, for example, and this is very interesting, the listening process is not simply listening to the questions of that preparatory document. I can add so many questions and so many inputs to that reflection as I need in my local church. So who is going to provide those other questions? That's where the challenge comes. The communities have to raise their voice. The universities have to raise their voice. Each institution in the church have to raise the voice and say, well, we have also these other issues. And the diocese has to listen also, not only to the response, but to the issues that need to be addressed in each reality. This seems complex, or seems sometimes difficult, but it's not so difficult if we assume our own responsibility and do a good pressure in the dioceses to have these other questions incorporated and to have these other problems in our local church being reviewed. So I think it's more a question of if we want to contribute to this process and really contribute, or do we just want to be passive, continue to criticize the church and not do any proposal at all in any instance and level of the church? So my expectation is if institutions are going to engage, not simply parishes.
Yeah.
Institutions such as universities, institutions such as so many institutes of pastoral activities that we have in each diocese. So it's not only about that small team that will be appointed, but also the pressure that we can create from our own institutions to contribute to this process. So it's all also in a way in our hands if we want to move forward and contribute, or if we want to stay passive and we'll let others do this process.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. So it's not just, yes, the diocese need to be listening, but we also need kind of the parousia, the boldness from the institutions and the lay organizations and so forth in speaking up about what the concerns are that the church has.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you giving me your time, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much, James. And I hope this motivates so many people to engage. There is always hope if we assume as subjects our involvement in the church and not as a passive object in the ecclesial life.
Great. Thank you. I hope so too.